Before we turn the stage over to Miriam Gilbert and her guests, Ron and I would like to take just a few minutes to talk about the upcoming season. They are going to talk about the fabulous opening production of Red. So we'll go on from that point. In mid-October, we open Kimberly Akimbo by David Lindsay Abaire, who brought you last season's Good People. Kimberly, of the title, is a regular teenage girl, except that she has a rare age-increasing disease and is typically played by an actor my age. Me, as a matter of fact. Kimberly has a very dysfunctional family, including a thieving aunt who will be played by Christy Hartsgrove Moores, a favorite of many of ours.
And November's jam-packed, and it starts with a special two-night performance of a brand new script-in-hand production by my best friend from high school, Rick Williams, and me. And unsurprisingly, I guess it's about our hometown, Columbus Junction, and the World War II years, and the sacrifices and the simple joys of that time in our hometown. It's 2 nights only, script in hand. It's called Good People.
No, it's not.
Or no, that's last season. This is called, I didn't write Good People. I wrote A Grateful Nation. I need bigger print.
And what happens at Thanksgiving, Ron?
At Thanksgiving, the day after Thanksgiving, so you know what we're doing on Thanksgiving, we're going to open a brand new one-man adaptation of A Christmas Carol featuring Tim Budd. Yeah, and he'll be joined on stage by Tara McGovern of the Beggarman, and it's going to be a wonderful, wonderful play. It gets right back to the heart of what A Christmas Carol is.
And we'll ring in the new year with a whimsical comedy, romantic comedy called Lucky Me by Robert Casely. This is a national New Play Network rolling world premiere. And Lucky Me is about never having to give up on finding love, even when you live with a tyrannical father, Ron Clark, who keeps chasing away your boyfriends.
Mm-hmm. And he also happens to be blind. Yeah. And then we're going to have our annual showcase of monologues, Walking the Wire. This year the theme is Classified. I'm very excited about the possibilities that presents us. That's in March. And then in April, we'll launch another world premiere. Megan Gogarty, one of our favorite actor-performers in the whole wide world, has a brand new play called Housebroken. And it's about the joys of buying, selling, and trying to own a house in these economic times.
That is 7 plays, jam-packed, fun-filled, and that does not even count the 4 Dollar Dog readings of brand new plays as well. We just hope that you will be there over and over again this season, and I want to thank you for being there for so many others of our seasons. But do join us this year on Gilbert Street, and now, Miriam Gilbert, the originator of this Thursday Theater Talk series, and so many other wonderful things at Riverside Theatre, our dear friend, the rock star of Thursday Theater Talk, who will introduce her guests. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. The play that opens this year's season is called Red. It's by John Logan. It's a play, it's a two-hander, and it's essentially a play about Mark Rothko and the Seagram's murals. And here to help me talk about it, because this is not my area of expertise, so I'm just going to work in the obligatory Shakespeare reference there. It just went by you real fast. There's probably a way to think about Rothko and Shakespeare. I just haven't come up with it. But I am lucky enough to have with me Professor Craig Adcock from the Department of Art History, who teaches modern and contemporary art history, and who has written a book on James Turrell, who is an American painter very much following on in terms of what he does with light and color from what Rothko was doing. And so I see interesting connections between what you teach and some of the scholarship you've done. Also joining us is Dale Fisher, whom many of you may know from the University of Iowa Museum of Art. He's the curator of education, which means, as he explains to me, that he is in charge of setting up outreach programs and educational programs for students and faculty and the general public, and it's hard to think of anybody that doesn't include in Iowa City.
In Iowa.
In Iowa, right, and who is a particular fan of Rothko's. So we've got something to start with. If, however, I just thought, if like me, the name Mark Rothko does not immediately ring a bell, or you're wondering what are these paintings that this play is based on, I thought I'd just show a few of them first to flash up on the screen to get them there, and then we'll turn the lights back on and start talking. I've got a few questions for these gentlemen, but as always in the Thursday Theater Talks, your questions and insights are good. So, one of the Rothko paintings there, and you'll start seeing how they work. Just a moment. I don't have names for any of them. I just show them. You look at something like this, and you see why the play is named Red. Or here's another one. And these are, as you can imagine, big. Here's another one in which he branches out. It's called Maroon and Orange. I thought even though the play is named Red, I could just sort of work that one in.
How big is big?
How big is big? Dale and Craig, how big is big?
Feet.
Feet.
6 feet, 7 feet.
Yeah, on the scale of the entire screen, often.
Okay. And one more, this is not Rothko. This is a famous painting, however, which is alluded to in the play. This is Matisse, The Red Studio. But it's clearly something that Rothko seems to have had in mind. And certainly there's a lot of discussion about color and so forth. So I just, when that flashes by you in the play, you'll know what they had in mind. And I think we can even have the lights on, Bond. Thank you. So does that help just a little bit? Get a sense of Rothko and what he was up to. There were a whole series of these Seagram murals, and maybe we could just start by saying a little bit about what draws you to these paintings. What's important about them for you? Craig.
Rothko exemplifies what abstract art at its height was all about. Abstract expressionism, one of the most important art movements of the 20th century. It's the movement that kind of generated the hegemonic control of the art world by America after the Second World War, when abstract expressionism emerges as a key moment in the history of art. And abstract expressionism is divided into sort of two main branches: action painting on the one hand, and Jackson Pollock probably exemplifies what action painting is all about. And then the other main branch was color field painting, and Mark Rothko exemplifies what color field painting. So they're, in some ways, the two quintessential, abstract expressionist artists in many ways. And abstract expressionism is, as I say, the kind of culmination of a long 20th century tradition of pure painting, just painting as painting and not being about anything but painting, right? And so Rothko is really good at doing that. The paintings are better in real life by far than they are in a projection. You just can't capture the really amazing quality, a kind of depthless depth that they engender. He painted layer after layer after layer of subtle color, and that subtlety is often lost. When you're projecting light through it, they seem brighter than they actually are. They're more subtle than that. And Rothko himself liked to have them seen in very dim light so that they were kind of an encompassing experience. And the paintings that we're talking about, the Seagram murals, and also the Harvard murals that he was painting at about the same time, and then later the thing that he was working on right at the end of his life, the installations at the Rothko Chapel in Houston, all of those were instances of him trying to create not so much an individual image, but an encompassing spatial kind of experience where you were kind of in a total environment. So, and the nearest you can actually see of these dreams, since both the Seagram murals and the Harvard murals aren't really available to be seen anymore, and the Seagram murals never got installed, the Rothko Chapel is the place where you can really see what he was after. It's really, anybody seen? A few of us have.
I'm going to Houston in late October.
they're
I'm planning to see
terrific.
them there.
Terrific non-denominational kind of a space, just a very contemplative, place to be. So a very beautiful space, the
Right.
Rothko Chapel is.
Yeah, Dale?
So, yeah, seeing the Rothko Chapel, actually makes Texas worth going to. Well, one of the things, first things first, whenever those images were flashing up, somebody over here said, it's sideways. And it's not sideways. These paintings here, his classic multiforms, which were rectangle stacked on rectangle, those are the classic paintings. And these are atypical of that classic body of work. He was doing something different that was site-specific to the Seagram's building. So he was, in a sense, negotiating with Philip Johnson and Mies van der Rohe. And so he was considering that in the form while he was doing this. But what was the question? Sorry.
Well, no, that's good. No, just to say that the murals that the play is concerned with and that we're talking about were originally commissioned for the Seagram's building and for the Four Seasons restaurant in New York. And the play takes place in the late 50s, around 57, 58. So Philip Johnson called him and asked him to do these murals, and he envisioned them in a particular space. What happens is sort of the story, one of the stories that unfolds in the play, but they were imagined for this space. And now, as you say, if you're in England, you can see them, some of them, in Tate Britain, and you can see them in Houston. But I was just wondering, because you've seen them, what draws you to them in particular, and what's important for you about Rothko and these murals? Just on a personal level even, or a personal artistic level.
Well, I decided I was going to be an art teacher when I was in 7th grade. And so whenever I decided that's what I was going to do, I got out the encyclopedias. Oh, great. It's me and technology.
It's on. You're good. Just use that one.
So I decided that I was going to teach art when I was in the 7th grade, and so I just started looking up artists, and so I looked up Picasso and Rembrandt and Van Gogh and all of these names that I recognized, and I looked at those works and went, geez, I don't like these at all, And then I started looking, and I found these other paintings that I gravitated towards for some reason. I have no idea, and it was the abstract expressionists. So I had this long-standing relationship with them, and over the years my taste has branched out quite a bit. And so, I did learn and come to like a lot more than that, but this is always kind of home base for me for some reason. And like Professor Adcock said, the idea that these are meant to be seen in a kind of dark, subdued, contemplative place is something that I liked about them on some level intuitively as a kid, and still do. The fact that you can compare them to these religious icons with the gold leaf that are lit by candles in these old stone buildings is a wonderful thing, I think. And so given the fact that one of Rothko's words that he keeps going back to is transcendent, transcendence, transcendence, that's it for me. But then with this idea of scale, I did look up a couple of quotes because you primed me, so I did that. And so one of his quotes, he said, was, I realize that historically the function of painting large pictures is painting something very grandiose and pompous. The reason that I paint them, however, is precisely because I want it to be very intimate and human. To paint a small picture is to place yourself outside the experience, to look upon the experience with a reducing glass. However, you paint a larger picture and you are in it. It's something you can't command, which I really like. And then while I'm reading, since I don't read comfortably in front, I'm just going to do my second quote here. And this is specific to the Seagram's mural. So he was excited about working with these giants of American architecture, but then there was this change of heart that took place, and he told John Fisher of Harper's Magazine that for the Seagram's mural, his goal was to paint something that will ruin the appetite of every son of a bitch who ever eats in that room. So, you know, there was a change of heart that took place between the commission and the process of making. So,
well, it's interesting when you bring up the whole religious aspect of things and the fact that that we see them now in a chapel, because one of the moments in the play that has always struck me is when he talks about going to Rome for the first time. This is Logan's Rothko, and he says, I go to the Santa Maria del Popolo to see Caravaggio's Conversion of Saul, which turns out is tucked away in a dark corner of this dark church with no natural light. It's like a cave, but the painting glowed with a sort of rapture. It glowed. Consider, Caravaggio was commissioned to paint the picture for this specific place. He had no choice. He stands there and he looks around. It's like under the ocean. It's so goddamn dark. How's he going to paint here? And if you know, you know, Caravaggio did 2 conversions of St. Paul's, but this one is the one where Paul is lying there on his back and the light is just emanating out. And the horse is there. No Jesus at all, if I'm remembering that painting correctly. And that sense of the painting generating its own light and forcing you to sort of share the experience with Paul, who is clearly just knocked out by what's happened there. Yeah, Craig?
One of my favorite stories about Rothko is that during one of his exhibitions in New York, he would come into the gallery and kind of back up to the rheostat and turn the lights down as dim as possible so that the gallery would be dark. And then the gallery owner would come out and say, what the heck is going on? And turn the lights back up. And so there was this kind of game that they played for a while. But Rothko clearly wanted the light to be low. And even though he might not have been able to articulate it in scientific terms, it was probably because he wanted his viewers to be dark adapted, you know, to switch from, you know, cone vision to rod vision, and you're literally thousands, up to even 1 million times more sensitive when you're fully dark adapted than you are. It's sort of something like 8 or 9 orders of magnitude. You really, the lights do seem in a dark, when you dark adapt, the lights does seem to come up and on as you adapt to the local conditions. It's comparable to what happens in a Gothic cathedral. If you've walked into Chartres from a dark sunny day and you can't see a thing when you step inside because it's so dim, but as you dark adapt, all of those windows seem to just come alive. You know, the light comes on. Similar experience in a Byzantine cathedral, you know, teeny little windows, you've got mosaics everywhere reflecting what little light there is, but you go in there, you dark adapt, you can see it. And I think Rothko wanted something like that. So my recommendation when you're in Houston is to wait until, the sun has gone down to look at the murals. Either that or get special permission to be in there in the very early morning. That's the best time to see them, when there's not a lot of light. Because the building is designed by Philip Johnson, but he put too big of a light, let too much light into the thing. So in the bright day, it's hard to actually see the paintings, and I think impossible to see them the way Rothko really wanted them to be seen. He wanted them to glow, as you say, like the conversion of St. Paul.
And is this related to the fact that those dark colors, the reds, the purples and everything, that in order to see them properly, you've got to dark adapt, as you're saying?
Well, you don't see color with your rods. You see color with your cones. So it's an interesting kind of phenomenon. You see the light intensity, but there's something. I was just tramping around out west in the desert this summer on a couple of occasions, and as the sun goes down, the light stays up pretty much in the sky for an hour after the sun actually goes down beyond the horizon. But during that period, especially when you're out in the desert, there are all these wonderful gray, blue, greenish plants that are, shrubs that are, and those things just seem to turn on, just to come up. So there's something about the hue that intensifies. At the luminance level is going down, but the hue is going up. And so there's that just special, or at least that's the way I, think I'm perceiving things. And so I think there's something like that going on in a Rothko experience as well.
Right. At any point, feel free to interrupt, raise your hand, make a comment, ask a question. I wanted to, so I just get that out there so we can be stopped at any time. I wanted to ask a little bit about what I might call the political side of the art world at this time. We're talking about the late 50s. And I like the way, Craig, you sort of suggest the two kind of main schools. I'm wondering, I guess I just don't know, to what extent do you think that people like Pollock and Rothko were, in some sense, always thinking about how they were going to be seen, how they were going to be regarded, that they're aware that there's a public out there making judgments, and that there's, in a sense, a history that's going to be written, and they're going to be part of it. Is that, I mean...
Well, yeah, I don't really know,
Yeah.
enough about the personal lives of either artist really to answer that. I think, you kind of hope that they didn't really care. We're just
You hope
working
they
about the
didn't
art,
care.
but
And yet-
probably they were
I mean,
aware.
the fact that Rothko accepted this commission, which on the face of it, I mean, to put murals in a fancy New York restaurant does not immediately seem to me, I mean, I think he thought he could somehow control it and must have realized at some point that he couldn't.
Yeah, I think it was the right decision not to put them in there. It'd be a terrible place for Rothko.
Yeah.
They really do need to be in a quiet, simple space. I
Right.
think that would be,
All the-
what's in there now is a great, gigantic mural by James Rosenquist, a late pop art painting, and that seems to be appropriate for that kind of setting, but not a Rothko, I think.
Yeah. Dale, do you have any sense of, I mean, was there a kind of a political world there for these artists at all, or
Well,
not?
I mean, I think that they were aware of the reputation that they were creating, because with our Jackson Pollock mural, the big myth was that it was painted in one session that lasted 18 hours on New Year's Eve, which is, none of that's true. And Lee Krasner, Pollock's wife, she was the main spokesman for that version of the story.
Because
But
it was
it's
a better
not-
story?
Because it's a better story, and everybody wants to believe the big romantic thing. This play here, great, but that's not really Mark Rothko.
Okay.
That's not really him, I mean, it's really close, but it's not really him, but so, there is this kind of image making, and I think that their work, I think that they were conflicted because they were devoted to their work and to their idea, but they were in this fishbowl where they were being watched.
Okay.
And and it was a problem. I mean, that's something that all of these artists before and then and now, that's something that they still face, I guess.
And because you've got a young guy in the play who comes in as the assistant to Rothko, and who clearly is willing to go and look at newer things. I mean, there's the scene where he comes back and reports on this exhibit he's seen, and names a whole bunch of people, starting with Jasper Johns, Roy Lichtenstein, and so forth, who come later. And it's clear that Rothko just doesn't have time for them, doesn't care about them, and sees them in some ways as challenging who he is and what he's accomplished.
Yeah, but it's the case of whether you want to compare apples and oranges. Either you can't, or you can, or you can and you can't compare apples and oranges. I mean, you can't look at the pop artists and seek the same things.
Right.
You can't look at the abstract expressionists and try to see the same things that, African artists were doing or whatever, in a certain sense, unless it was stuff with a religious bent to it. But, these abstract expressionists, one of the jobs at the museum is to try to take people back in time and make them realize how revolutionary these works were. We've had 70 years to look at them now.
Yes.
We're used to them. When they were new, and they were fresh, and people had not seen things like that before.
And I'm wondering if that comes up when you're teaching
Oh, sure,
Rothko.
yeah. It does. They're still pretty radical for most people.
That's what I wondered. I mean, do students look at them and say, what is this?
Well, yeah, I think so, yeah. Yeah, it's, we were talking before about how do you approach these paintings that really don't have the kind of references people, are generally and that was, of course, the battle that the artists themselves were trying to break through and get people to understand. So it was a really daring thing for them to have done, so to make that leap and to stick with it. You know, I'm always impressed that they must have been getting a lot of negative pushback, right? But they had the courage to stick with it because they really believed in what they were doing. And come to find out, you know, it did triumph. The triumph of the American school, as one book has it, as the title, you know, and it really did have that. And so they must have been feeling that, because by the time the setting of the play, you know, abstract expressionism, both the color field and the action painting side of things, had a good deal of success. So it really was becoming. But that wasn't true just 10, 20 years earlier, when, you know, nobody was, you know, real, except for a handful of dealers. And, you know, the art world was a much smaller place then than it is now, right? So there must have been more of a feeling of camaraderie, us against them, you know, all of that. So you would assume, getting back to your earlier question, it was probably less politics in those days than now, I would guess, just
And
because it was
more
smaller.
a sense of community. And even though Pollock and Rothko are going in different directions,
Yeah.
certainly in the play what emerges is that
Well-
Rothko is always comparing himself to Pollock.
A little bit of competition, no doubt,
yeah.
was true, but there was also this common goal of, you know, of painting this kind of work and getting it accepted, I think, was, you know.
Good. Kathy, you had a question.
I did take it.
Do we want to carry a microphone into the audience?
If we can, but if not, I'll just repeat the question.
That's all right, that's all right. Here we go.
I did take an art history class once, but it's not something I'm really empowered by. But I've read a lot about artists, and they always seem to be making sketches first. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of sketches. And I guess I'm talking about pre-20th century or something, but I get the sense from what you're saying that this is more, that the emotion that you want to elicit from the person who's watching it is more from the color and the light that comes from the painting. Do they just spend a lot of time mixing colors, or do they try it out and throw it away and then try it out and throw it away? Or what's the process for something like this rather than a more realistic picture, I guess I'd say?
Well, in terms of somebody like Jackson Pollock, you can't do better than to look at the recent film with Ed Harris. If you've seen Pollock, you know, even though they take some leeways with the actual facts of the artist's life, they really did an excellent job of recapturing the technical way in which Pollock worked. So they hired a bunch of young artists to, you know, really get in there and redo those paintings just the way Pollock would have worked himself. So that's about the way it did. It was a very spontaneous thing.
And you were talking about the gestural thing.
Yeah, the drawing was in the gesture. Now, for Rothko, it's a much slower process. You know, he's rubbing probably with his hands and fingertips and with claws and brushes as well, you know, to get those layer after layer of very subtle color that you can kind of seem to look back into. I don't know how far, but, you know, there's a little bit of spatial depth in those big floating forms that we were seeing in the painting.
And that's,
Try it like small spaces you expect you wanted to get and then reproduce that large.
Well, they all did some, I think, preliminary thinking about these things. You know, like you know, Dale was just saying, you know, there was some considerable preparation in that gestural stroke that's repeated in a work like Mural that we have here on campus. And most of them, I think, there were kind of ideas that he had that he was going to work. There's the famous film that was done in 1950 by Hans Nemeth, and one scene in that is him painting on a piece of glass. I think that work is now in the Museum of Modern Art, but the camera's down below and you see him, you know, laying a few things down and then kind of gluing them down with these big skeins of paint that he's drawing. And at the one point he says, well, I've lost contact with that one, and takes everything off and cleans the glass and starts over. So there really is this kind of spontaneousness in it, you know, so it is the sketch in a lot of ways as well as the final product, I think.
right. Arthur?
Well, and, sorry.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Dale, and then
Well, and then Professor Adcock mentioned the Pollock film, you know, which, yes, that's a really great movie. And the only thing that I can find wrong with it now is since the Getty did the restoration and they did all of the x-rays of the Pollock, he didn't start with the dark color. He started with yellow and not the dark color.
Right, yes,
and
I
that's the
think
only
like that.
thing I can think of that's different. But, you know, it's it's a heck of a lot better than whenever I was a kid, you know, and you would see Kirk Douglas playing Van Gogh, and they would show his eyes concentrating, and then they'd cut to a bad reproduction of Starry Night, you know, and so on. You know, that's a lot better than that. And so I think this play is too, because it does deal with the process, and these works are so much the direct result of the process.
Right.
It's not about image, it's not about reproducing visual reality and recognizable things. It's meditation and process.
Yeah.
Right.
And then I think both artists want the audience to participate in that. They want them to be sort of encompassed by the final work. Mural, since we were talking about that, or Pollock's other large paintings, you know, he wanted you to see those really up close. You're supposed to stand just a few feet back. You know, and originally Mural was in in Peggy Guggenheim's apartment. You couldn't get back from it. You were right up against it. And so that makes it into a kind of an encompassing, oceanic kind of experience. So that notion of the sublime, an abstract kind of sublime, was something that these artists really took seriously.
Right. Art, we're going to get a mic to you. Thank you.
Well, okay. Let me explain myself before I get to my question. I paint, but I'm an amateur, and I've studied art, and I've tried that sort of thing, but I'm a psychologist. Anyway, and I'm also a listener of, sort of a professional listener of music, including contemporary music. And I'm not a musician, okay? There's something about the impact issues I want to get to, but say Rothko in particular. If you look at a single Rothko, just as in some museums, they have only one. There's kind, maybe it's the big red square like that. And you look at it, it's much different, that impact it has, than if you have the opportunity to see a row of Rothkos lined up almost in terms of chronological or perpetual story. The impact is much different. Then it starts to read, in a sense. You can feel something about it. That the other one, well, you can come, but it's just a square, something like that. There's light, and you don't get that feeling. I draw the analogy to music. The music of Philip Glass. You hear a Philip Glass, you know, it's fleeting. You don't have a chance to really repeat it. But you hear it's one series that way. And if you only stop at that point in listening, there's no impact. It leaves you cold. You may get a sense of percussion. But if you listen to the whole thing, let it go on to the end. And if you can hear it again, you get that repetition. And now it's in a different dimension a little bit of flair like that, but it's really structurally not much different all the way through. The impact is altogether different.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah.
So I always argued in terms of trying to talk about contemporary modern music. People say, oh, you know, what does it say? You know, they're so music is a fleeting experience that you have. You hear it and it's gone that way. If you don't hear it again, the impact is somewhat lost that way. Art, pictorial art, graphic art like that, has the advantage in that you can stand there and let it repeat itself, watching it, then go back and come back again. It starts, as I use the word, read. And I try to get people to understand, for that new music, you've got to hear it again, you've got to hear it again. The advantage of the musician has in rehearsal, they do that and they love the piece.
Right.
But the listener doesn't. And the same thing with art, the watcher. The impact is different in terms of what they're watching.
And I'm wondering, Art, if what you're saying then relates to how Rothko wanted these things to be shown, that he did want to have them together so that there would be that sense of impact. So in other words, that and it reminds me also of what a teacher I taught with many years ago said, the first time you teach a book by an author you've never taught, you can't just read that book, you need to read 2 or 3 more, because you don't know the language. I mean, it's English, but you don't know that author's language. But once you've read 2 or 3 more, you're getting it. And I think you're saying something similar, and I think that's what Rothko, and even in the play, he talks about how he hopes that he can get the people in the restaurant, when he's still thinking that these will be in the restaurant, that he will somehow control them so that they will be part of the experience he has designed, but it involves this whole set of murals. It's not just a single painting he's doing, it involves a set. And that seems to be important. Yeah?
Well, I think that is an advantage that a retrospective would give you for an artist's work, or something like the Rothko Chapel, as opposed to a single Rothko in the Museum of Modern Art, where you do get a repetition that gives you a more encompassing kind of total experience of Rothko. So, yeah, my favorite Rothko is, of course, not a Rothko, but the chapel with, multiple Rothkos in it.
Absolutely. Question?
See,
Yes.
and that's actually my least favorite. And I wouldn't underestimate just the power of one singular work as well. But, yes, there is, I agree with that. An artist does a body of work, one work after another, and they end up with a body of work, and that makes more sense than just one work.
Right.
But at the same time,
But is your
That
experience...
secular work depends on construction. By looking at it and looking at it again and moving your eyes here, and then it starts to be the same.
seeing it several times. But I'm wondering also whether your sense of that individual work is informed by the fact that you've seen so many others.
Oh, of course.
So in that sense.
Yeah, of
Yeah,
course.
gentleman in the back there. Question. This is good. Takes a little longer than over on Gilbert Street, but I'm glad we're pitching in here. Great.
Hi, I believe you mentioned Cape Breton, and could you explain the significance with regards to Rothko?
I'm sorry,
This was earlier.
Oh, Tate Britain.
Oh, Cape Breton.
Tate Britain. Tate Britain is the big museum down in London, and they've got a big collection of Rothkos.
Oh, really?
That's
Okay.
all. Yeah, Tate Britain.
Thank you.
It's called. There's more than 2 Tates now, but there's the original Tate, which is called Tate Britain, and there's now the Tate Modern, where they Tate. Sorry, my enunciation not clear enough. Other questions or issues here that one wanted to bring in? Yeah, Tom.
What kind of response?
You got it. We're taping, so.
Oh, you are?
Yes.
Then I'll be long. No. What kind of things were art critics at the time saying? And I'm
About
sure there
Rothko?
I'm sure there were some positive and some negative, but did the positive ones get what was going on?
I think many did. Of course, the famous champions like, Harold Rosenberg and, Clement Greenberg, they kind of made their reputations being champions of abstract expressionism, right along with the artists. So they were great, supporters. There were many others as well who were. So there was a whole cadre of pro-abstract expressionist people, the critics and a handful of museum people, and a small number of galleries that were, supporting this work. Yeah. But there was a lot of negative criticism. All the negatives we've all heard.
Yeah.
Jack the Dripper, of course.
Jack the Dripper. Oh dear.
I don't know how many people are familiar with the 2,000-year-old man with.
Is this Sid Caesar?
Brooks.
And Carl Reiner.
Oh, Carl Reiner, yeah.
They're in a cafe in the village somewhere I grew up. But it was sort of like they see those speakers up there, and the guy, he says, "You like it?" He says, "Yeah, I'll lacquer it up for you."
Right. Scott?
So what's the genesis of the play?
What's the genesis of the play? I'm not sure what pushed Logan to write this. I honestly don't know that. I think he was clearly fascinated by this somewhat unusual notion that an abstract expressionist painter would have accepted a commission to paint murals for the Four Seasons. And I think he found in that a contradiction too delicious to resist. So that's part of it. The other thing, though, is that, well, there are two more things. One is, I think he saw that by bringing in the young man who comes in as Rothko's assistant, that this, in a way, allows Rothko to pontificate, to offer his ideas about art, to lay out his thinking. In other words, it's tailor-made for that kind of thing. And I think one of the things he's interested in doing is writing a play about how does an artist think, and what does an artist think about his own art. And a lot of the time, Rothko is not painting, he's looking. He's looking at these murals, and he's talking about them and thinking. And he even says in the play, an awful lot of what I do is I think. So for me, part of the impetus is, how can I explore this? The third thing, and I think we're very lucky in terms of the guy who's directing this play, Sam Osheroff, who's a guest director from Florida, to do this. Sam started as a professional actor, and then he sort of felt, I'm not sure this is for me, I'm going to be a visual artist. And he went off to Seattle and spent 2 years as a painter's assistant. So in fact, he lived the second role in this play, the young man in this play. And I think he's going to bring that experience and that knowledge to the play. One of the most exciting scenes in the play, all the reviews when this opened, gosh, about 6 or 7 years ago, talked about it, is that you see Rothko and his assistant get a canvas ready. You actually see them painting. They spend a lot of time talking, but there is a scene which just has music underneath it. The stage directions go on for something like 2 pages, and they paint. And we watch this, and we watch exactly the layering process that Craig has talked about. Because what they did is, first they had to prepare the canvas and stretch it and everything, and then there was the whole priming of it and getting the basic thing on. And we watch that. I don't know how long this scene takes. 2 minutes? It's a 2-minute scene. But it is going to be, I think, the moment where he's trying not only to do the intellectual stuff about art, but actually to make us feel what it's like to have been Rothko painting. Yeah, Dale?
Well, and then not to speak for the author of the play either, but he also wrote the script for Martin Scorsese's movie on Howard Hughes. And I think he also wrote Helen Mirren's movie on the Queen. And so I think he does do a lot of biographical works about this public-private, interior-exterior type of existence.
So that's also an interest for him.
Yeah, so I think that's something that he's particularly specific about. And then you mentioned the play in that scene where they're stretching the canvas and doing all this stuff. Yeah, it's great that they show you how this is done.
Yeah.
And one of the things that whenever they did this show on Broadway was the producers and the director and everybody, they went to some fragrance company, I can't remember who it was, but they made a scent that smelled like turpentine and paint and everything else, and they released it in the theater.
Oh, really?
During the play, yes. While these people were painting, they released the smell of these materials in the theater.
This is the very first play I worked on here many years ago was when David Knopf did The Kitchen, which is set in a huge restaurant kitchen. And I still remember that the first thing that got cooked on stage was somebody frying onions. There's nothing that makes you feel that you're in a kitchen like that smell. Ina, you've got a comment, and Ina.
And we don't have chemicals at Riverside Theatre.
No chemicals were used in this production. Ina.
I hope this isn't an irrelevant question. Didn't Riverside Theatre do a play called Art a few years ago that was also about abstract art? Can somebody remind me what that was like?
That was the play Art by Yasmina Reza. And the previous director of the art museum came and was my guest for that. That's about an all-white painting, which somebody buys and which his friend cannot understand why you would spend this much money on a white painting. And I think the difference there is that's very much a play about the value of art and what constitutes value in art. Acquiring it and the extent to which value is somehow created by the person who's willing to buy it. So it's, I don't want to say it's totally from the consumer's point of view, whereas, but it strikes me that that's that emphasis, whereas this is really trying, I think, to get inside the mind of the artist and inside the hands of the artist as well. There's another question here. Good.
Not to inflate the discussion so much, but one of the initial questions was, what did perhaps the artists perceive as their role and their interaction with the public? So in that context, what I'm trying to phrase is a thought here, listening to everybody else. There were centuries of art that preceded the 20th century, and you've both remarked on how altering it was, changed the art scene to the United States. But my question is, in looking at the nature of some of the art that Rothko created and what preceded it, is, in your opinions, is what Rothko was generating more universal than a Dutch still life?
That's a challenging question.
That's the easy question, why don't you?
Yeah.
Well, I think the artist would probably have liked to have thought so. You know, I think they wanted that, and a lot of 20th century artists have. You know, from Malevich right up to Rothko, right, where you reduce things down to some kind of quintessential essence. You know, and so that's what they were after, certainly. You know, and it's up to us to decide whether we buy it or not, whether we accept that as a success or not. You know, for me, you know, it's a different way of approaching something like that. You know, where you know, I'm like Dale. You know, my first love was abstract expressionist painting. I was really, my first really awareness of high art was when I was a teenager. I guess I was 14 or 15. One of the girls I dated in high school, her older brother was a very serious abstract expressionist painter, and he and his friend, this was in Amarillo, Texas, where I grew up, and there was a group of artists, including people like Connie Smith and Ed Blackburn, and my girlfriend's older brother's name was Warren Davis, and they went on, they're not terribly well known, but but Ed Blackburn's a very distinguished Texas painter to this day. And they all, you know, were really great. And they, for some reason, kind of adopted me as their mascot and let me hang out at their studio and help them with their foundries and things like that. It was glorious, you know, it was just wonderful. So my first love was the work of people like Rothko. I was a particular fan of Franz Klein when I was that age, but the abstract expressionists in general were heroes of mine. And so that's what I first thought serious art was all about. And so for me, of course, the answer would be, yeah, it does do that, but you know, it's just as good or just as powerful to me as it's a different vocabulary, to be sure, but you know, it's comparable in terms of quality or impact or those kinds of registers with a Dutch still life painting, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in my opinion, one of the things that I think is a defining characteristic of a work of art is some sense of the universal, or whatever, you know, that transcendence, that spirituality, or whatever it is. But you know, you're talking about thousands of years of art, and people are more alike than they are different, and over time, you know, things don't really change as much as you think they do, and that kind of thing. You know, I mean, 35,000 years ago when they were painting on cave walls, you know, people were born, they died, and they filled up the time in between, you know, and that's still what people do. And so when you look at these works of art, you know, it is this variation on a theme, you know, it's just a record of human experience. That's all it is. You know, well, how many different expressions of that are there? Well, for one person, thousands, you know, so millions, and, you know, just exponentially it just grows. But, you know, people can always kind of find their own relationship to these things. And
I was thinking of they have the exhibit at the Black Box. still life, all these things that would be in a cultured society. So you had the still life with utensils, cups, things, flour, all these things that would exist in the household of a person of culture, Western Europe. What I've been thinking about is the Rothko, and imagining if you would take that Dutch painting and you would go to the heart of Africa, you'd mount it on an easel, and you would put the Rothko next to it, that it's conceivable, even with the universality, that what might be more instinctive, more universal, would be for somebody to, in fact, be drawn to the essence of color in its very simple form, although the creation of it by the artist is by no means a simple process. Whereas the still life, they might say, what's that?
What is that?
What is that?
Yeah. And you're talking, aren't you, about how much is culturally determined? Yeah. Carolyn.
Yeah, I'm curious about the actors who have to do this every night on stage. Is each stroke very carefully rehearsed? Is the picture going to look the same every night, or do they have some spontaneity in the way they paint it?
Well, we're not going to see a painting. We're just seeing the first go over the canvas, preparing what is essentially the background. So I suspect that in that sense, it's going to look relatively the same every night.
And the moves are very choreographed in terms of who goes where, when, and
right.
Yeah.
I will just say, Logan, in his setting, says, most importantly, representations of some of Rothko's magnificent Seagram mural paintings are stacked and displayed around the room. Rothko had a pulley system that could raise, lower, and display several of the paintings simultaneously. The paintings could be repositioned throughout the play with a different arrangement for each scene. There is also an imaginary painting hanging right in front of the audience, which Rothko studies throughout the play. Last sentence. Alternately, the entire setting could be abstract. So it just pulls the rug out from underneath you there. So I think in that sense, it helps. And one of the reasons I'm so grateful to Craig and Dale for joining me, is I think it helps to have some sense of what Rothko's works were like. But I don't think that the play aims at being an education in Rothko.
Well, and the Rothko family strictly forbids us showing his images.
Aha. Well, there we are.
They're not on view.
Yes. Question.
Along those lines, the University of Iowa Museum of Art owns some Rothkos.
Yes, indeed.
So it would be really wonderful if we had a building and you could see them. But Sean, the director, yesterday,
picky.
he mentioned that it is possible to maybe put one or two of them up in the black box during, I don't know if you've talked to him about.
Actually, it's not possible.
Okay, back to Dale on
Okay, so yesterday he said it was, today it's not.
Well, you know.
Uh-oh, politics in the art department.
Okay, so
do you want to
so we get a building and then we can actually see them
Do you
in
want
real
to say
life.
something about the Rothkos we've got, even if we can't see them?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Dale was going to try and get me slides, but evidently that was hard to
yeah,
get.
our
computer, you said, was...
Yeah, our database is down for some reason.
Sorry. You have to deal with what I picked up off the internet.
But putting things up in the gallery during the play, you know, was a great idea. But the fact is that we had to take everything down at the IMU because the construction in the basement is vibrating the building. And so the things on the shelves were rattling and the picture frames on the wall were rattling. And they had an earthquake expert, whatever they're called, seismologist. They had them come in and measure the room for vibrations and determine what was safe to put up in there. And so the paintings can't go up in there. So, you know, yeah. So
delayed gratification. This is the sign of being a grown-up, is that you can do this and that we can somehow get to this at some point. I was just hearing about an experiment about this on NPR.
But that's part of our job as a staff too, you know, is to bring reality into Sean's sense of enthusiasm.
Sorry about that.
Sorry.
Sorry about that.
Oh God, did you tape? Is this being taped?
I'm afraid it is. That's why we've all got these microphones and everything on.
See, if this wasn't being taped, I could say they heard me wrong. I was misquoted.
Yeah, that's okay. We're sworn to silence on this. Any other questions or thoughts from people?
Back to Polly's question about the works that we have.
Yes.
We have a couple of his works that are from before he was doing the classic abstract expressionist, when he was still kind of moving out of his surrealist mode. We have a work on paper that's a watercolor and pen and ink on paper, and then we have a small oil painting, and they're very beautiful. And then we have a work on paper from 1968, which is 2 years before his death, and it's oil on paper, and it is only 38 inches tall, you know, and Mark Rothko killed himself on February 25th, 1970, and part of the reason for that is this battle with depression, because he had an aortic aneurysm, and he was physically limited from doing these monumental epic works that he was doing, and he kind of went downhill from there, and had a lot of problems with that resulted in him committing suicide. And so on. So we have one of those last works, which it isn't the classic Rothko, but it is a really powerful one because of that story that does feed into that kind of autobiographical arc. And while we're on the topic of that, in our paintings, the three that we have, on November 6th at 7:30 in Art Building West, David Anfam is going to talk on, his title of his talk is Around and Beyond Jackson Pollock's Mural. And so he's going to talk about Pollock's mural and put that in context. But he also, in 1998, wrote the catalog raisonné of Mark Rothko's paintings, and so he did this book that Yale published in 1998 that has all 690 whatever paintings that Rothko did. And if you take that book and you flip through it like one of those little comic books that you have when a kid, you know, where the stick figure moves or whatever, you can see Mark Rothko going from representational to surrealist to abstract expressionist, and then color drops off and it goes almost to black and white, and then it ends in 1970. It's a really beautiful book. If you have $300, go out and buy it. It's really nice.
But surely there's a copy in the art library.
I don't know. I have my own copy.
Okay.
I don't look for it in the art library.
Well, one of the things that I think has come out of this discussion, and I'm just grateful to all of you, but especially to Craig and Dale, is that whole question of seeing and how we see and what we see and how we respond to it. So I thought I might just close with the fact that the opening sentence of this play is Rothko saying to Ken, his new assistant, "What do you see? Wait, stand closer. You've got to get close. Let it pulsate. Let it work on you. Closer, too close. There. Let it spread out. Let it wrap its arms around you. Let it embrace you, filling even your peripheral vision so nothing else exists or has ever existed or will ever exist. Let the picture do its work, but work with it. Meet it halfway, for God's sake. Lean forward. Lean into it. Engage with it. Now, what do you see?" I think that's what this play is really about. And thank you so much for helping me talk about it. Thank you.